so much for coming. And I'm very excited to be here. Tosin and I met through professional reasons, but have now become friends. So if we get a bit informal, I'm sorry. And yeah, I'm excited to talk to everyone a bit more about your practice, but also sort of some of the context and the concepts behind it and how your work ties in to that. So I want to start by talking about Lagos, where you live, and the kind of broader West African culture, which are both big inspirations for your work. Can you talk to us a little bit about that inspiration and how that sense of place and identity shapes your architectural and design work?
Okay. First of all, thank you all. I'm so happy that you've come. I'm overwhelmed by your presence, so thank you. I went to school in the UK, so it's really exciting for me to be invited to this kind of location to speak. It almost feels like I've topped a hill, so this is a big milestone for me.
There's a mountain after the hill there.
But I think Lagos does influence my work. We're all products of our experiences and our exposures, and my work very much is from a child who grew up in Nigeria in a very dense urban environment. The exposures of coming to the UK to study, understand technicalities of space from this environment, but being able to tie it back to my culture, and also to be able to create an identity to be able to understand my identity and to celebrate it. And I think that's ultimately a lot of what my work is about. I grew up in Nigeria in the 80s I don't know if anybody else grew up in Nigeria in the 80s, but everything that was from outside was better than what was local. I don't know if anybody knows the word awayan. This was the term for anything that was imported that was better. But then getting to a place where, coming into yourself as a designer and then understanding the importance of identity and why is what I have not considered as of high value as something from outside, and being able to juxtapose and position them and realize that there's a way that you can represent yourself and put it at par with an international style, international brand, and know that it is of value. And that's very much what my work has been about. So yes, my experiences of being from Lagos have influenced my work, but my experiences and my exposures and my technicalities of being an architect have come from my exposures from Europe. And ultimately my work is kind of fusing the two.
Yeah, I mean, we were going to talk about that a little bit later, but let's talk now. Because as you touched upon, and just to kind of let everyone know, like, you went to architecture school in London, and then one of your first major jobs was at OMA in Rotterdam, and then you went back to Lagos and established your practice there. It was about 2012 that you set up CM Design Atelier.
Yes.
So what was that kind of process like, and especially when you set up your practice, what was your goal in terms of fusing those different contexts, let's say, and creating a kind of unique sensibility aesthetic that combined them?
So I don't think when I initially started, I intentionally set it up to produce a particular type of language, which is what I have now. I had moved back to Nigeria after working at OMA, which is a very big design practice, and getting back to Nigeria and working for a local practice. And it wasn't about design, it was just about producing buildings. A lot of the firms who were doing very well at the time were just producing rudimentary housing or office spaces. It was never forcefully about design, and it wasn't
really contextual.
It wasn't contextual, and I started to get anxious and impatient. I had gone to a big design school, the AA. I'd worked at a big design practice, and I wasn't doing very exciting design work, and I really wanted to use the skills that I had learned. And I just knew that there was more than just putting walls up and putting a roof. And that ultimately was the tension that existed that made me decide to step out. Now, my aesthetic, I would say, again, comes from my exposures and experience working in Europe, but then being able to fuse it with a contextual kind of narrative. And that's really where I've been able to create what I would consider as Afro-minimalism.
Afro-minimalism?
Yes.
Do you want to tell us a little bit more? Come on, bring that to life for us.
So I guess it starts from modernism, but it's really minimalism. It's very clean. It's very plain. It's very about materiality, tectonics. Staying true to form, simple principles, which I believe is also very African. I think we live in a day where I guess people's understanding of Africa is bright colors, large patterns, which is also correct. But if you look at a lot of, especially contextual, and I like to use the word contextual instead of vernacular, contextual.
Yeah, we might use that word a lot tonight.
Contextual architecture is, especially within an African context, is very, I won't say simple, but very plain. It's about the materials. It's about the terracotta. It's about the thatch. It's about the using the materials in their true form, which is really what I have been able to take in the context of modernism and minimalism and kind of tie it back in.
Yeah. Well, we might return to that issue of modernism later and kind of the role it has played in the evolution of African architectural design over the last century. But I do want to talk about the fact that earlier this year you were appointed the curator of the Sharjah Architecture Triennale. Woo! Very exciting, which will take place in 2023.
Yeah.
And your theme for the event, which is the beauty of impermanence, which sort of focuses on the adaptability of architecture in the global south specifically, must bring a lot of sort of overlooked or undervalued work into the spotlight. So I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit about that process and what you've been discovering and what's been most exciting so far.
I think first and foremost, and there are a lot of people here who are architects, and in the process of practice, you get on with your job. You're paid to provide a service, to answer a question on the building project. But then when you get the opportunity to be a curator of something like the triennial, you're answering a question. So you're stepping away from your day-to-day and using the tools that you've acquired through practice, through training, and setting up a series of questions. And the process of the curatorship is giving me that opportunity to question these things. Now, everything that is going to come out in that exhibition and has come out in the theme is based on experiences growing up, understanding my urban context, my exposures, my culture, and then this idea of adaptability. And there's something very beautiful that comes out of the global south that we don't experience anymore in the global north, which is where you have architectures that are built off resources, scarce resources, adaptability, understanding environments, conscious of environmental climatic conditions, working with constraints. This is still very much fundamental in the global south. And being able to understand those principles, see what existed in our contextual architectures, what are we bringing forward to the present day, what has been lost, what is being retained, and who are the players in our modern context who are still working with these principles of adaptability that exist. And being able to showcase these on a global scale, I think is so fundamental. And it's really been a journey of discovery. It's been a journey of redefining myself, understanding these principles, finding who are the players in this context, and also learning from them in that process. And it's really been very, very, very interesting.
I was going to say, I mean, you're one of those players, right? Those are principles that drive your work.
Yes.
But has anything kind of surprised you, or would you say that you've learned something or been surprised by something going into it?
So I won't say that. So I think in the process of the curatorship and also in my process of work, I'm constantly learning. I mean, there's so many people doing interesting things in that space. There's some people in the room who I've seen. I'm going to give a small shout out to Adeshokunbi, who is looking behind himself. But, he, there are people who are really experimenting with materials, and I think particularly in the global south, where we have limited resources, we don't have all the means to develop new technologies or to develop new biosystems. We're working within very fixed constraints, and then to see people doing amazing creative things within that is really great. Ade has done a lot of work experimenting with with soil, with cement, using color. He does a lot of stuff with color, using irons, Papa too as well, has done interesting things with glass in cladding, or and these are always, what's really great about these solutions is they're not always about spending a lot of money. And I think this is also what's really important about the work that comes out of the Global South. You work within limitations and you're able to really push the boundaries of things that people don't even expect can be achieved, and then create interesting architecture, interesting spaces, interesting technologies of passive systems, which is something that has always been quite fundamental in the architecture that's come from the Global South. Not always looking at producing architectures about heavily dependent on the artificial services, passive systems, cross ventilation, lighting, shading, and to find the players who are really pushing these technologies now, and seeing what they're coming up with. Because the biggest challenge with working from this idea of adaptability and scarcity of resource is that it doesn't tend to work on a very large, dense scale. But we do live in an urbanized world. And how do you bridge that gap? But there are people who are really exploring this.
Because, we're facing a future that is one of scarcity of resources, of limitations, of the urgent need to look towards passive solutions because of the climate crisis and because of the, carbon emissions that we have been pumping out into the world through artificial systems. So do you feel like we're in this moment where, lessons from the Global South can and should be applied on a much more global scale?
We very much are.
Yeah.
And if we really think about it, our current urbanism is the last 400 years, right? Last 400 years. The bulk of our damage has come from our period of industrialization, but man has been on this planet a lot longer.
Yeah. And
the systems that existed were about renewal, replenishment, rejuvenation, not extract. And so there are many lessons that we need to look back and understand, because they will and they can actually address some of the challenges that we face moving forward.
I'm very excited to see the work that you spotlight in the triennial. I want to move on to think about your work a bit more broadly, because obviously, as well as the curation and we've seen some beautiful beach houses, I think, in Lagos. Of course, your work spans a great diversity, including product design with your firm Ilea Ela.
Yeah.
And also, you've just completed a project, a rural humanitarian project for the UN Development Programme in northeastern Nigeria. I wrote about it, I should know. So in Garanam, which is a village you designed for community that was displaced by Boko Haram attacks in 2014. So I would love you to share that project with us and tell us a little bit more about that. Obviously, that project sort of links into a lot of what you were saying about limited resources, budget, but also climate contextuality. But yeah, if you can tell us about that project, that would be great.
So,
there it is. Yeah, it's right there. Fantastic.
So in Ghana, for anyone who's from Nigeria, if you tell them that you're going to Borno State, they'll be like, it's not done, I remember even my mom, when I would say I'm going, she would say, don't tell me until you get back. Because there's this fear that, it's such a dangerous place. But to be honest, I took it as an opportunity of an adventure, you had
a military escort.
Let's be
honest.
You have the guys in green. It's really nice. But it was a very humbling experience. I think the biggest lesson I learned from it is that people are people wherever you go. No matter where you end with the lottery of birth, people have ambitions. People want to have better lives. And I worked with the community to come up with a housing scheme. There were a lot of stakeholders. There's the UN, there's the government, there's the commissioners, there's the community, and making sure that everybody is happy, but really understanding their culture. And I'm from Lagos. I'm a Yoruba girl. The ethnic group that I met in Borno State are Kanuri. I didn't even know who the Kanuri were before I started this project. So that was as a Nigerian, being in Nigeria, not even knowing your own country's cultural extent. I had to learn about their culture. They're very much a Muslim community as well. With that and understanding their culture and being able to create an architecture that would be appropriate for them, it was a very humbling experience. I was very drawn to the Borno cap, which I had seen across Nigeria because it's standard traditional dress for men, but not really understanding where it was coming from, and these beautiful tessellation patterns that are created, and then infusing that back into the architecture. So, I mean, it was a constant crossbreeding at different scales and pulling elements important. Something that was very, very integral in the work that was done was understanding the importance of public and private space within a Kanuri household, and then the importance of having a reception room which allows a male visitor coming into the home to be able to be within the space, but not to be within the inner courtyard of the family space where the wives and the children are. And this is something that is very, very fundamental to their existence. And for a lot of the resettlement towns that have been done in the housing had omitted this important singular element. And so they had expressed the importance of it, and we were able to then incorporate that into the architecture. But also using the tessellation patterns that I had observed and understanding the extremities of the climate. It's a very arid climate. It's Sahel. A lot of the trees in the area had been taken down because they wanted to reduce lines of sight that the Boko Haram insurgency would hide in. So getting that there wasn't enough canopy cover, and then starting to create these kind of tessellating pattern canopy covers that could be used for outdoor activity, public space, integration, interaction. So it was a back and forth. But what's really interesting is that it happened on many different scales, you know.
Yeah.
And hoping that as the community go back into the space, they are able to read elements of their culture and their identity in the space as well. So it doesn't feel like someone has come from some foreign place and just given them a solution that doesn't really work for them.
Yeah.
Something that I will say that was a little challenging for me initially was you come from a modern context and they tell you that they don't use toilets.
Oh, really?
No.
Okay.
So, you know, there's no need for a WC. It's a pit latrine. And I learned something. Don't give people what they don't want. It's not for us to decide that we need to elevate their status.
Yeah.
If someone is used to cooking outside, they don't need a kitchen. If you're used to squatting, you don't need a WC.
Yeah.
And they will not thank you for it either. So it's so important to really understand who your client is and design an architecture that's appropriate.
And it doesn't matter if that client is the wealthy owner of a house, beach house, or...
Again, design is always human-centered. You must understand the context in which you are creating.
I think that's why the project has gained so much attention as well, because as you mentioned kind of before, the resettlement programs that have existed, it has been much more about, here's a house that we've decided that that's what you need, not paying attention, not asking people, just that radical act of listening and talking. But obviously it's a new kind of project for you. It was your first sort of humanitarian project. I think we discussed that. What would you say, though, are the sort of threads of commonality between the Nigerian project and your existing work, and like how is it connected to your let's say?
I think ultimately it's like I said, it's designing for people, you know, irrespective of who your client is, whether it's a very wealthy person or it's someone who doesn't have very much. The point is understanding exactly what they require and being able to create the right space. I mean, as architects, we're solution providers. We're solving problems. You know, if you are given a brief, or even if you're not given a brief, if you're given a context and you're told to go and understand what the challenges are, you must create an architecture that's appropriate as a solution. But what's really great is that I'm able to start to see threads between the different sects and be able to draw inspiration from one to take to another. So funny enough, for this particular beach house, I was so fascinated with this canary pattern that it forms a patterning in the bar area, which will also be a mural that will exist within the school area of the community in Ngaranam. So they're constant threads. It's a pull and a push, and all these different sects influence each other.
Yeah. Okay. So the next question is about the sort of scholarship and research, and how there's not actually a huge amount of scholarship on modern Nigerian architecture, which has been, that architecture has been a significant inspiration to your work. And so how has that affected your research and your practice and kind of creating your own architecture?
So I'm going to give a little history lesson here. Yeah. I'm a big fan of history. So I think if you look at, and I'm only going to speak from Lagos as a reference. It happens for a lot of other West African cities, but it's a good starting point. So a lot of the architecture that existed prior to the 1950s and 60s was a style of architecture that came in. We call it the Brazilian style. It was from returning slaves, either from Sierra Leone or from Brazil. Particularly from Brazil, and it's a style that was associated with affluence. So usually the ex-slaves or the returnees, because some of them never really became slaves, because if you were picked up on the coast of West Africa before they could sell you off, you got dumped at Freetown. But you got educated in the British system, so you were well exposed. A lot of them became traders. They did very well in business. Some of them became medical doctors, lawyers. And then some of them moved back to Nigeria, but they came as affluent members of society. They were not indigenous. They came with a style of architecture that was predominantly like a Brazilian style, so almost like a Portuguese Spanish style of building. And it was associated with affluence. So what happened is it started to move across the Western region as people became more affluent. It was a style of inspiration. So that was predominantly the style that existed, apart from what would have been indigenous. In the 1950s, at the turn of when a lot of African countries were gaining independence, the British government and also French government invested very heavily in state buildings. And with that came a lot of foreign architects, and they brought with them tropical modernism. So when you look at University of Ibadan, you look at University of Lagos, a lot of those buildings that were designed with breeze blocks, shaded windows, ventilation, came from that era. And that really is a period of high architecture, particularly in West Africa. And then after that, we moved forward, and then you had a lot of different styles, but they were never paying attention to passive systems or understanding of the environment. Now, this period of modernism has been what has influenced me the most. Maybe also because it's the architecture I saw growing up. A lot of those buildings were built very well. So even today, they still stand out as quality buildings in Nigeria. And a big architect of that period is Friar Otto and Jane Drew, who did a lot of work for the British colonial government in West Africa. Their style of art, they did University of Ibadan, the library. I don't know if anybody knows that building. It's a really beautiful building. They did a lot of stuff in Ghana, and that formed a lot of my personal influence. Another big architect in Nigeria was Alan von Richards. Does anybody know Alan von Richards? No? Oh gosh.
You can tell us.
Well, he's a British architect who naturalized Nigerian. He married a Nigerian. He did a lot of amazing experimental architecture with different materials and really pushing the boundaries. And he ended up producing quite a lot of buildings in Nigeria, but a lot of them have been renovated now, and they've kind of lost the values that he started with. But really, the architects of that period really did understand our climate. And what's happened is you have two factions of architecture that are developing now, particularly in West Africa. You have those who are emulating, I would call them the globalization fanatics, who are just following the style of anything, anywhere. Oh, your client wants something from Florida, can you replicate it? Oh, I saw a house in the Americas, I want a house from Italy. And then you have those who are understanding the environment, who are taking from the principles of tropical modernism and developing them. And they're evolving them to create a kind of new identity. So you have these two parallel notions that are developing. And yes, we don't have a lot of documentation of this, but it does exist. And I'm also hoping that the work that I will do in Triennial will showcase the architects who are really pushing the principles of context, of modernism, of future value, and of passive systems, because we still don't have 24-hour power, which I'm sure most people know. We really need to push these passive systems. This is really the future, even in environments where you have the luxury of resource. That resource is still limited. Yeah. And we need to design our buildings more appropriately for that.
Amazing. I want to just finish before we go into the Q&A, just thinking about what you're up to right now. Obviously, you just finished doing Garanam project, and you're very busy with Sharjah, of course, but can you tell us a bit more about what else you're working on, what we can expect next?
We have a few exciting projects in the background. Not that I want to give too much highlight now, but I will say that as a practice, we've been very fortunate to have a very diverse portfolio. Yeah. So I won't say that we are too known for just one sector. Yes, I know they're the beach houses, but that's just one thing that we do. We do quite a lot of commercial work as well. We do residential. We have an interesting flagship store, which will stay silent for now. That'll be coming out towards the end of this year. But it's a lot of it. Yeah, in Lagos, a lot of exciting work. Our work is still predominantly based in Lagos, but I think from all the experiences that I've had so far, particularly in this last year, I'm very much a vigilante about sustainability and ensuring that my work will continue to push this forward. For example, the work that's happening in Garanam forced me to really reflect on passive systems that do work, and I think that knowledge has ignited my consciousness that I need to push this more for the projects that don't ask for it. Yeah, and so this is going to be something that will come across more in the work that we will produce moving forward and the projects that we're doing on ground now.
And yeah, I mean, that ties into an interesting conversation around kind of the role of an architect and to what extent they can kind of influence, push, nudge the client. Because of course you said that an architect just has to provide a service, the client, of course you want to respond to their needs, you want to be responsive, but do you find that there's like a tension sometimes that you want to give them what they want, but at the same time you want to nudge them in a good direction towards sustainability?
I do think that there's a very healthy balance an architect has to create. We're not artists. We don't have the luxury to work in isolation and people just value and appreciate what we've done at the end. You are providing a professional service, and at the end of the day, someone is paying for it. I do believe that as architects, we have a responsibility to the environment, but we must make our work attractive. People will only pay for what they value. And if you are able to position your work by pushing these values of sustainability and reduce amount of resource and staying true to the environment and designing appropriate for climate and making it attractive, we're in a much better position to get clients aspire for that. But it's a chicken and an egg, but it's very important that we ensure that we make that attractive so that people want it. And it will not happen overnight, but the more projects you get the opportunity to showcase the values that are important to you, the more likely you are to get people who will gravitate towards you for that.
Definitely. I know I said that was my last question, but it's just a tiny question. You talked a lot about the context of Lagos and Nigeria, but if someone asked you to come and do a project in London, would you come do it?
Yes.
Okay, you heard it here first.
I'm pushing.
She's committed. She's committed.
I believe you must always take opportunities when they come.
Okay, cool. Like being my friend. All right, guys. Obviously, I don't have all the right questions to ask. I'm really keen to hear from you. So we don't have a roving mic. So you can put up your hand if you have a question. I'll call on you, and then I might have to repeat your question for the recording over the mic. So who would like to ask a question?
So I work in the technology industry, and for us, it's very much about innovation, especially within Africa. So how would you say within architecture, innovation comes in to help you achieve your goals?
Honestly, in architecture, I believe the bulk of our innovation comes in the materials that we use to build and the systems that we put in place in buildings to ensure that we reduce the amount of energy that we use. I will say honestly, particularly in Africa, there hasn't been much exploration in that. We don't have a lot of research and development done into materials. We very much build like in the 1950s with cement, concrete. But there are people who are pushing boundaries. I want to just give a shout out to Papa Mutayo, who completed Jinkashin Barre's house. Where is he? Where's Papa? And they did the project is amazing because they used earth, laterite, to create blocks from the ground on the site to build the building. And we need to have more of those kind of projects where we're allowed to experiment. And it's great to have a client who pushes you and insists that they want you to go that much further in exploring of materials. But yes, I believe our innovation will come from our exploration of more materials.
Hi, I just did my master's at Kingston, and I told my dad Tosin Oshinowo was there. So the beauty of impermanence, I feel like this is what we as humans and architects are afraid of, like our base human condition, like things rust, decay, and age. But there's a beauty in it. What would you say is your favorite example of the beauty of impermanence in your work?
Gosh, this is a tough question. I'm not going to answer it directly. I'm gonna take it from a slightly
answer your question with a question. What is impermanence?
So I think first and foremost, I think one of the biggest problems with where we sit as a civilization now is that we have been taught that everything has to be permanent, but it doesn't. If you look at the northern Nigerian architecture, there's a process of renewal and regeneration. At the end of every rainy season, you repair the wall. You know, it's a cycle of life. It's very much a cycle of the earth. But we've developed a civilization that we're taught that everything has to be fixed, but it doesn't have to be. After all, you cream your body every morning, Abby. So it's the same thing. And I think if we almost need to change our mindset back to that and to produce buildings that are about that process of, it doesn't have to be fixed. I know we do this as architects. Oh, we want to use this tile to ensure that we don't have to replace it. But why? Who decided that's the way it has to be? You know, we've just come into a civilization, we've accepted that this is the norm. It shouldn't be, because that's not the cycle of life. It should be healthy to be able to process the change over time. So, and I would say honestly, as a practicing architect who produces buildings for clients, I don't do that in my everyday existence. But that is something that even I am now more conscious that I want to imbibe. It's not enough to just say, I want to make it permanent. I want a process where I should be able to include, replenish, and renewal in my work.
Can I ask?
Of course.
So, the question is, obviously you do amazing for architecture, and we're talking about impermanence and what have you. So the question is, what kind of relationship do you develop with your projects after you're done with them? Is it a place that you revisit over time, or is it's like when you hand over the project, that's the end, you don't look back. Obviously you go back and take beautiful photographs. But what's the relationship that you develop with it over time?
Excellent question.
Maintain that relationship?
I think it's such an important point. And I do go back, and I think it's important to go back, because as architects, we're in the process of very much a top-down. We dictate, we assume, oh, everyone's going to use this building this way. If I put the road here, everyone's going to walk in that direction, which is not always the case. Everything we do is based on assumptions, and it's very healthy and it's very constructive to go back and check. Did the decisions I make work? They will not always work. And it's important that we stay conscious that we need to continue learning. And we learn from the decisions that work, we learn from decisions that don't work. But we are always adapting based on those experiences. So yes, I do go back and visit buildings. And yes, I have seen some things that work. And funny enough, you also see things that you didn't expect that happen in your buildings. And that's why it's important to do that process, that post-mortem, after occupation, and go back.
Cool post-occupancy evaluation. I love that you've made it into death.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm here all night. Yes.
Hi. Okay, so I just have a question about, you spoke about trees being cut down for your UN project, but when I was in Lagos, I did see a problem where there's an abundance of nature in Nigeria, but however, when they are building new projects, they seem to cut down all the neighboring trees, which kind of is annoying because trees are very spiritual, and I think a lot of our culture back then has stemmed around nature, soil, growth, and everything like that. So what is like your future plans with making sure that there's, more forestry, natural forestry, and more like spaces where, young Nigerian people can go and be amongst nature and architecture? Because, you build for people. So what is the connection with your future connection with nature and like architecture?
This is a great question because just selfishly, I am a big fan of trees, as you know, Sarah. So just for the recording, some architecture in Lagos has been cutting down trees. How can you, one, create architecture that celebrates nature and retains it?
There's Papa is the tree hugger in the audience. It's a big problem, to be honest. I think it's a big
tree hugging is a big
trees, not tree hugging, but we don't seem to value what we have. I mean, there are places in Lagos where they're widening the road and they just chop the tree down. No acknowledgement. This tree might be 100 years old. There is an issue. I think a lot of people in Nigeria do not appreciate the value of trees. Then there are those who fully do. I'm a big fan of trees. I've done a project where we actually incorporated the tree in the building, which was not what the structural engineer wanted because it was going to be too difficult for him to do the calculations. But I was very insistent that, we need to retain this. People will come and say, how did they get the tree in the building?
Some things are worth the calculation.
It's definitely worth the calculation. And it's a big problem we have in Nigeria. We're losing a lot of our forest trees currently. Some of the biggest challenges we have in the north, which has to do with the cattle herders looking for grazing ground, is because of deforestation. A lot of our trees are being chopped down and being taken to China to be made into wardrobes that they're selling back to us, by the way, which is ironic. And one of the artists who will be showing at the China he's done a lot of work in documenting the deforestation that we're having, because to be honest, it's a massive problem. And unfortunately in Nigeria, no one is talking about it. No one is talking about it. We've lost so much forest in Nigeria. They say that we don't even have Iroko in some areas anymore. It's completely gone. But if we don't speak about these things, it doesn't come to the foreground. So there is urban tree, but there's also forestry, which is even worse, But if we bring this awareness to, bring it to the attention, not just to the local but international, community, hopefully it will garnish for some change to happen.
Do you find when you're working on projects in Lagos and using wooden materials that you're able to source from kind of sustainable forestry practices, or is it just too opaque?
I don't think anyone is doing anything sustainably. And I will say this, and this is actually very disturbing. Wood is one of the cheapest materials you can buy in Nigeria.
There's a reason, yeah.
Yeah, and that's a big problem. It's a big problem. It's almost too cheap because it just shows you that it's not being done, responsibly.
Okay. Any questions? Keep going. Yes, Will.
Thank you for an excellent talk. I'm really interested in this idea. The question you put out, a project in London or in the global north or something.
There's not a project in London yet. It's in my dreams.
Big question about that. But if all you've spoken about using local vernacular materials knowledge, if you were to then relocate this other place, how do you, all of your projects using the modernist language and your photography and stuff, how do you then transplant that to a client who wants this, but in London, you say no because the process is actually what we're buying. How does an architect transfer to a place and not just deliver?
I think as an architect, your work shows in two very strong realms. There's the materials that you use, but also the spaces that you create. It's very important to work with materials that are local, that are contextual. But the architecture that will be created will be a problem solving. And it will be based on my rendition as a spatial designer, but also working towards the brief. But yes, always pushing the boundaries with the materials appropriate for that environment. I feel very strongly about this. And I think, again, like I had said earlier, when you start to become an architect of aspiration, you're able to encourage and garnish your clients in a particular direction, and that's always the hope. You don't always win the battle, but you must push as far as possible. More questions? Yes, hi.
The trend in Lagos now is the high rises. Have number 4 and have the cabin next to it.
Yes.
We're about to top one opposite the bridge, and by nature, I'm scared of heights. But what I have to ask is, I have many fears with that kind of building, those buildings in Nigeria. For example, if there's a fire, we don't have an efficient fire service. There's in Dubai and all these places, you see that those buildings have, instead of painting for sustainability, they have cladding. I think. And we know from what happened in London, So, as an architect, what are your thoughts on these high rises with knowing our Nigerian mentality to work, and what would, if somebody engaged you, 70, 25 spirit building on body, what would you readily take it, or what are your thoughts? I'd like to know.
So we actually have a project now that's in Lakowe, which is, it's not high, it's only 9 floors, but we're dealing with the same challenges. I think ultimately you almost must put things in context. So for example, a high-rise building here would be very different from in our environment, because we would have a staff quarters that would go with it. You would most likely have a front kitchen, a back kitchen. So the elements, at least in the layout, that are completely different. We don't have a fire system that works, but we do build ideally towards British standards, which I think would be the safest thing to do. I think in principle, you can, as long as things are put in place. For example, fire doors, you have your safety stairs, it can work, It does have its challenges. It's also a lot more expensive because you have to put a sprinkler system in, which you wouldn't have to do if you're only ground and 2 floors, But it can work. But we are moving away from living at low density, if we're going to be very honest. We're a city of 21 million people, Nobody knows the number, to be honest. Oh, is this being recorded? But in reality, we will have to at some point move up, yes, and just ensuring that it's done responsibly. Also still bearing in mind culture, like I said, we do live in a slightly different way than you would in the West, but then also just making sure that it's also safe. But it's happening.
Yeah.
It is happening, whether we like it or not.
Because I thought about it in respect of like greens and still wanting that kind of a green, the likelihood of a green
Okay,
A green high rise.
Yes, and so you do see that. I've seen that happens a lot in the Netherlands now as well. People actually have green terraces. Those things also come with quite a lot of maintenance.
Yeah.
It's not impossible, but it's a decision that's made very early on in the day. But yes, it can work.
And plants on a terrace don't make a high-rise sustainable. There's definitely other things that go into it. More questions?
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, I was wondering whether, considering the style of work and what you do, whether you encounter any, or whether you encountered any challenges with the regulatory authorities in Nigeria.
Challenges with Nigerian regulation. All right.
These things exist. We all deal with the challenges. I mean,
The Nigerian government is listening.
to be honest, it's a system that has not been updated. So, for example, I love the question about the high rise. You have a Nigerian planner who will tell you in a high rise building that is heavily serviced, oh, there's no cross ventilation. Does anybody know what this means? So, if, for example, this building is cross ventilated, a window in, a window out. When you're building that kind of high rise, services play such a heavy role. The ventilation system, even in London, most of those buildings don't have cross ventilation. But a Nigerian planner is still working off a low density building and principles that don't function anymore for a high rise. So yes, we do face those challenges, and they haven't upgraded their regulatory system. So yes, we all deal with it. Yes. Yes.
Over the last couple of years, we've seen obviously a massive kind of focus on climate emergency and global responses to that. What have you seen kind of manifest in West Africa, which was Nigeria in that period? And also, how do you think we can bring sustainability to the attention of the wider masses, i.e. the public, but also potential leverage on the social capital in terms of growing population, especially young population, as well as potentially the environmental capital in terms of natural resources that are abundant in Nigeria?
That's a huge question. It's the climate crisis.
Climate crisis. Yeah. So I'm going to relate this to a very real reality. Please, how many people know the price of diesel in Nigeria? So we've just had a situation where they're slowly trying to remove the the subsidy that the government provides. So everything has really gone up in price. So everything is really expensive. Now, one of the biggest challenges with sustainability is always the capital cost. It costs more to design buildings that are more sustainable, that are more energy efficient. But if you, and particularly in Nigeria, why it was a challenge is because everything was subsidized. So diesel and petrol was very cheap. Now we're getting to a situation where it's becoming very expensive. You don't have to tell anybody that it's better for them to spend the capital cost now to gain the results later. So this is dealing particularly for buildings and at least energy consumption. So it's becoming a conversation that is becoming much easier to have with clients. Everyone is really looking now at solar. Wind energy is now becoming more attractive. We do have a very strong wind, particularly at the beach. You get a very strong northwesterly wind, so it's quite appropriate. I do know that the process of investors and batteries is a little bit still expensive, but it's definitely a conversation that's a lot easier to have with people. When you talk about sustainability, are you talking about education and other?
I guess in some sense, you've got young population, growing population, potentially creating new markets in terms of creativity, crafts, manufacturing.
I mean, this is still very much a massive challenge that we have. 2050, Africa will have the highest population of young people, and it's a huge potential, but it's also a huge catastrophe if education is not put at the foreground. I can't say right now in Nigeria that education has the biggest budget. It's a massive challenge, and unfortunately, if we're not careful, this is going to be a big challenge for us moving forward. But there is a lot of potential, but the onus is on us to ensure that it's utilized appropriately. It's a big alarm bell, to be honest. It is.
Your thoughts on how to unlock that potential in your sustainable way?
Education. I mean, you can't do anything without a literate society. It's so important. The basis has to be in place. There is so much you can do with numbers of people, and especially where the alarm is that we're moving into an age where technology is becoming more important, where we're actually moving away from needing people in numbers. And if Africa doesn't get to a point where we start to really consciously, intentionally put structures in place that these people will be of value, we really are running into some treacherous waters if we're not careful.
Last question, because we have to wrap up, but I saw that there's a question here.
Yeah, sorry, it's kind of a little bit related to what Nara was saying. Wondering if you had any projects that were, because here a lot now we're talking about not building new all the time and kind of retaining and conserving. I think I know the answer to this already, but just wondered if there were clients coming to you more with, why don't we retain bits of this building and add on to it, as opposed to kind of raising everything and starting from scratch?
Adaptability projects.
Adaptability projects. No, not as much, but you're very right. That really is a way to move forward. And I know that it's happening a lot now in the global north, and instead of taking an office building down, it's about stripping and rejuvenating it, or getting it to a point where it can be used in its current state. We don't have as much of that yet in Nigeria, but you also have to remember, to do that, you must have a building structure that works, as well. So for example, I know Paul had mentioned to me, particularly what happens in Sharjah, if you check the quality of the concrete, if it's gotten to a stage where it's already beginning to deplete, you have to then strip that down. So it's also about designing buildings that will become easier to adapt in the future and gives you a lot more flexibility.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions, and obviously, Tosin, thank you so much. It's been the greatest pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.